Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s candidacy seems to be proving a real challenge to President Biden's reelection bid. As conservative columnist for the New York Times, Bret Stephens points out, many Americans are skeptical of RFK Jr. Many others are interested. In his most recent piece, he calls Kennedy a crank, adding, quote, his long-held anti-vaccine views sit poorly with most Democrats. He has said the CIA killed his uncle and possibly his father, that George W. Bush stole the 2004 election, and that COVID vaccines are Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci self-enrichment scheme. He repeats Kremlin propaganda points like the notion that the war in Ukraine is actually a U.S. war against Russia. He has nice things to say about Tucker Carlson. But Stephens highlights that some are willing to overlook the candidate's controversial opinions.
Voters' sentiments appear to reflect in recent polling that indicates RFK Jr.'s growing appeal may thwart Biden's reelection prospects. The insurgent candidate is polling at 20%, which is considerably less than Biden, but is going to potentially make his reelection bid very difficult. Luring voters obviously will be a must for Biden. He has to count on every vote, but Hispanic and black voters could be a problem for him, as a New York Times article reports. A May survey showed that a mere 22% of Latino voters and 33% of black voters were aware of any specific thing President Biden has done in office to improve their lives. RFK Jr. also gave a major speech recently, and some of that was put together in clips. Let's play it.
That today. Or are we going to remain stuck in a self-righteous story in which America is categorically good and our opponents are irredeemably evil? If we remain stuck there, so will every other nation. It's not only America that's fallen into this simplistic good guy, bad guy thinking. That's the example we've set for everybody in the world. No wonder it's been replicated everywhere, between Israel and Iran, between India and Pakistan, between Shia and Sunni, between Jew and Arab. It's tribalistic. Us versus them thinking is tearing us apart. These are the wages of war. But when we take the first step toward peace, we will become once again a true world leader, a moral authority.
So that was from a foreign policy speech he gave in New Hampshire. He echoed a lot of themes. Bret Stephens talked about them, characterizing them one way in his article, negatively in his article, but talking about the U.S.'s role in international conflicts, having stirred the pot, having instigated various conflicts for decades, is part of what attracts many voters to RFK Jr. They don't like the kind of black and white thinking that makes it difficult for us to reckon with our role in conflicts and then have a better possibility to actually remedying those conflicts.
Right. I think it's not a coincidence that RFK Jr. is really taking off right now. Elites and experts have establishment, government, scientists, foreign policy consensus. It has all embarrassed itself horribly in the last few years. On foreign policy and on COVID in particular, what the normal, smart, expert people said was right has not aged well at all. And so people who have railed against elites and the establishment and experts, do I think they're right about everything? No, but they're looking pretty good right now. And that includes people like, on the right, like Tucker Carlson, people on the left, or ostensibly were at some point on the left, the anti-institutionalists, your Glenn Greenwalds, your Jimmy Dores, your Russell Brands, all those people, people who raised questions about what the scientific community was saying about COVID and the foreign policy consensus was saying about Ukraine and the Middle East before that. Those people just look embarrassingly wrong. And so a candidate who speaks to that, you might call him a crank, you might say he's a kook or he's crazy. Maybe, I do not agree with everything he says. He's running as a Democrat. I'm not a Democrat. But these fundamental questions that the supposedly sober, sane, expert people got wrong have created an opening for the outsiders who question them.
Absolutely, 100%. What's so interesting about the way that Bret Stephens characterized everything in this article is is that it's so out of step with what, like it or not, majorities of Americans believe. So I just Googled it real quick. Gallup says a majority of Americans still believe that JFK Jr. was killed in a conspiracy. Whether that means they think it's the CIA or somebody else, they don't think that the public narrative is an accurate one, and 70% of Americans want those documents that were supposed to be released in 2017 under Trump still haven't been fully released. They want those documents because they are still skeptical of the mainstream story that's been put out there. To your point about vaccines, Bret Stephens writes, he said that that the COVID vaccines are a Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci self-enrichment scheme. Okay, well, we have reported and talked about on the show the extent to which there are built-in incentives to some of these grants that allow
the
people
WHO
who work at the government to
get so much
get
of its funding. The World Health Organization getting so much of its funding from the Gates Foundation.
Right, but also the fact that people like Anthony Fauci are able to get a percentage of the drugs that are end up being used in some of these government programs. And Kennedy has specifically talked about ending that conflict of interest and ending those kind of financial incentives. That's not hooey. That's not made up. You can think that those financial incentives aren't a problem, but he's not describing something that's not able to be substantiated. Stephens refers to the idea that the U.S. played a role in the Russia conflict, presumably, if you listen to RFK Jr., by expanding NATO eastward in a way that undermined our post-Cold War commitment not to do so. He calls that a Kremlin propaganda point. So to talk about a historical reality is a Kremlin propaganda point. Now, that's not to say, and RFK Jr. is very clear, that's not to say that Russia was justified in invading Ukraine. Right. That's not to say that that is not an illegal war and that they're also not violating international law. When he talks about the issue,
he does so much throat clearing to make sure no one mistakes him for a sympathy for the Russian position or what Russia's doing because it's unconscionable.
Right. So Stephens is illustrating, I think, really well in this point, in this piece, how out of touch not RFK Jr. is, but people in the chattering class like himself are, and how this is where the credibility starts to crumble. If you were going to write an article that on its face so obviously is unwilling to engage genuinely with the things that RFK Jr. are saying, you don't have to agree with RFK Jr. again, but to characterize history as a Russian talking point, to ignore the real issues of corruption and conflict of interest that exist in some of these revolving door government agencies, is to say to the public, I just don't care about those issues. And the public is saying back to the establishment media, well, I just don't care about you.
Right. I think the establishments need to cast him as a uniquely crazy or dangerous figure is not at all persuasive to people, because while he may get some things wrong, especially with you've brought up the technicalities of mercury being in vaccines. When we interviewed him, he brought up hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine and ivermectin. I am a perfectly open-minded person. I've looked at people who took this question very seriously, weighed all the studies. It does not look to me like ivermectin was doing a lot of good. It was wrong to cast it as a uniquely harmful,
even Joe Rogan pushed
poisonous
back in their interview.
Yeah,
Joe Rogan's issue was being accused of taking a horse dewormer, but he wasn't defending the efficacy of the drug.
So I don't, if he's making the claim that was the way to go, and there's a lot of definitive science showing that was helpful, I dispute that from having read people who did look at all of those studies. So again, it's certainly a disagreement. I have absolute disagreements with things he's saying, but to say let's say if we accept he's wrong on that, and I'm sure many people watching won't, but just bear with me for a minute. He's wrong about that, fine. But why does that make him the most craziest, kookiest, dangerous person when the establishment science people have also been wrong about the efficacy of all of many of these things? What they promised about the vaccines didn't pan out.
Put the science to the side. We're supposed to care more. The public is being told they're supposed to care more about someone being wrong about how their father and uncle were killed than a president and a presidential candidate who was wrong about the Iraq War.
Yes, exactly. It's exactly that. Where if you're outside the mainstream, being wrong about something makes you a kook. But if you're in the mainstream, getting a fundamental policy question wrong that killed thousands or millions of people in the result of having to do with our Middle Eastern policy, or again having potentially funded research, being in the establishment and having funded research that indirectly led to the entire pandemic in the first place, as we're now learning is not proven but likely to be what happened. you're still, you're not being portrayed as, you're not being run out of the establishment for being a kook and a mass murderer and like Dr. Frankenstein or something.
No.
It's just the people outside the establishment. When they get something wrong, it's unforgivable, you're a kook. And that is a double standard that I think people have caught on to and they're fed up with.
Absolutely.
More Rising right after this.